Real quick tidy up, bounce, get a pint of the hair and then go. 5 seconds.
4, 3, 2, 1. Let's go.
We good?
You're live.
Hi everybody. Thank you very much for giving up some time on your Saturday morning to join us for our second virtual tasting event. We held one a few months ago, I think it was 3 months ago, pretty much to the day, to go through our range of filter coffees. And you should have all received your packs with 5 samples this time instead of 4. We threw in an extra one as a little bonus because we thought it'd be interesting to taste it as well. It's another filter roast from us, but it's a decaffeinated coffee. You will have received some emails explaining how this is all going to work. Maybe you joined us the last time as well, but in case it's your first time cupping or doing an event like this, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the process before we dive into looking at the individual coffees we have on the table today. So you should have 5 bowls weighed out with 10 grams in each. The reason for that is we're going to use a very set recipe for how much coffee to use, how we're going to grind the coffee, and how much water we're going to add, and then the process for how to brew these cups. 10 grams, if we add 165 grams of water, is a really nice ratio to work for when you're brewing coffee, but it's typically what we use to cup as well. It's a 60 gram per litre ratio. So it's not going to be too strong, it's not going to be too watery, it'll be just right to taste the characteristics of the coffee. Everyone has different grinders, so it's very difficult to communicate what grind size to use here. We sent through a little cheat sheet to say if you're using a Baratza Encore or a Wilfer Svart or a Wilfer Uniform or a Fellow Ode or something like that, a jumping off point. But also the little tin is a reference guide, so if you need to go a click or two finer or coarser to get to a similar grind size, we should be all using similar grind sizes today as well. The other thing that's really hard is the water we're going to use. I'm lucky to be cupping here in the roastery today where we have a reverse osmosis system, so we can treat the hard water in London, soften it down, reblend in minerals to get perfect brewing water. You might not have access to that at home, I very much doubt it. I don't know what solution you're using for nice brewing water. We've got a really nice solution in our pocket that we're going to talk about in a couple of weeks. But soft, clean water with no off flavors is going to be perfect for tasting coffee with. Just like your tap's also fine, it just might muddy the flavors a little bit. So we should all be here. Some of you have also probably received pre-ground coffee as well, so you'll have 10 grams ground. Bear with us while the rest of us grind our samples, and then we can start assessing the dry aroma. Then we're going to boil our kettle, top all the bowls up, wait 4 minutes while they steep, and then let them cool down a little bit and taste. So I'm going to dive straight into it, because I know some of you have been waiting for a little bit already. So I'm on my Encore, I'm going to grind all the samples in the same order that we're going to cup them through. You should have the same order, which will be the first bowl being Emilio Gomez, the second Miranda, Huaman, Gregoria, the third Familia Granda, the fourth Kaigori AA, and then La Serenia decaffeinated filter at the end. I'm going to grind them now. Oops, missed a couple beans. Last sample coming up. Cool. I had a couple of beans stick in one of them because before grinding it's nice to add a drop of water or something. Helps prevent too much static building up in the grinder, so a couple just stuck, but it's all good. You realise I didn't purge between grinding the samples as well. If we were looking at maybe buying a sample of coffee or cupping at origin, it's proper to add a few beans between samples to not carry over any issues that a coffee might possess, to make sure you're just completely tasting the 10 grams of the coffee it says it is. But for this purpose, these are all clean, nice coffees. I'm not too concerned about carryover, and it'd be a bit of wastage because after these 10 grams, you've still got 60 in these sachets. So that's a litre worth of coffee you can drink from there. So let's not eat into that unnecessarily today. First step now is going to be assessing what's called the dries, or the fragrance of the coffee. Once you grind the beans and expose all of that inner surface material to the air, they become way more aromatic than whole bean coffee is. You'll see people looking at the retail shelf thinking about which coffee to buy, and they might squeeze it and smell through the valve. That does give you an impression of the coffee, but once it's ground, it is tenfold. The aromatics really burst out. So we're going to explore the dry aromas and then pour water on and assess the aroma again, called the aroma. Fragrance for dry, aroma for wet when you're cupping. And more things will come out then once the heat is added to the bowls. So I'd encourage you, pop your kettle on to boil now, whilst we smell the dry aromas. During this tasting, if anything really jumps out to you, if you find a particular flavour note or a particular aroma that is very clear in your mind, pop it into the comments and we can have a discussion of things that jump out. You might have the same experiences as other people, you might have different experiences. Smelling and tasting is so much reliant on your memory, and you're building up of a sort of catalogue of things you've tasted before. So doing these things together is really helpful, because if you can't voice a particular flavour experience you're having and someone else does, that's how you build that bridge, and you might then remember it next time. Be like, that's the word I was looking for. It was currant, or it was chocolate, or whatever it might be. So feel free to have a discussion in the comments. Towards the end of the cupping, we'll also be answering some questions you have. So I've got a colleague documenting those questions now, and we will go through those at the end, and hopefully I'll be able to answer any questions you have. So let's dive straight into the first sample, Emilio Gomez. Kettle's on. I really like to stuff my nose right in there, get as much aroma as possible, shake it around, lots of little sniffs. And the main thing I'm getting in Emilio Gomez is just a very comforting, classic coffee aroma. Sounds lazy to just say it smells of coffee, but that's the main thing. It's a very coffee. Very sort of robust and clean, but has a lot of warming chocolate notes, some roasted nuts. Very classic as far as the kind of coffees we normally buy are. And it's really lovely. Next up, Miranda. It can be helpful as well to dance between samples to really let the individual characteristics of each coffee show, because only really through contrasting against other things will the unique flavours in here stand out. And so immediately coming off the back of Emilio Gomez, in Miranda, it's a little more fruited, a little more tropical, a little more playful. And slightly more aromatic, a bit more amplified. It smells really good today. Familia Grande number 3, markedly different aroma profile to the first two. First time you really amp up that floral character in the coffee. Oh, super delicate, super clean. I think this will be a really interesting one to discuss with you all today. Fourth set, Kaigori AA. Surely the reason a lot of people got into specialty coffee is nice washed Kenyan coffees. So this I think will be a favourite amongst everyone today. Markedly different again. Suddenly it just smells like berries, or like when you're making jam, really pungent berry aromas coming out. Tiny bit of sort of spice, but very mild. And then last on the table, La Serenia Decaf filter. You might not be a decaf drinker, you might not even want to taste this, but I would urge you to. It's got a bit of a bad reputation in the specialty industry, decaffeinated coffees. But the type of decaf we're buying, I think, is very, very good. It starts as very good green coffee, and the process used to decaffeinate is our preferred method. And I think still we retain quite a lot of really unique coffee characteristics in here. Sort of marshmallowy smell, very, very caramelly. Lovely. All relatively mild currently, because all that's happening is the aromas trapped within those beans are allowed to escape. Now we're going to add water, and the heat from the water is going to drive out even more aroma. That's why we assess again once they are wet, once they've had boiling water poured on them. Boiling water, that's what we prefer to use. None of these coffees are roasted very dark, so there's no need to mitigate bitterness by letting your water cool at all. And it will help extraction. It will help you get a nice sweet full cup if you use boiling water. And when we stir the cups, we're not just going to tickle the crust on the top, we're going to properly mix them up, again encouraging a bit more extraction. So let's do that together. I'm using a scale. Typically I know that these bowls hold 165 grams of water when there's 10 grams of fresh coffee in there, but I'm going to weigh just to be a little bit more accurate today. You can do that, especially if your cups are not exactly suited to cupping, but after you've done it a few times and you've dialed in a cupping recipe to the vessels you have at home, you don't necessarily need to weigh every time if you just want to compare a couple of coffees, for example. I've got a timer to hand. Let's go. This is a pour over coffee kettle, so it's absolutely not necessary to have something like this to do a cupping. I actually prefer a normal wide mouth kettle because this isn't a little bit slow, but we're not in a rush today, so this is fine. And I can be very accurate with my dose. About 20 seconds between pours, so I know how fast to break between the bowls as well, so they each steep for the same amount of time. Think about this like a mini French press we're doing. We're just not going to plunge it at all, we're just going to sip out of it. Seconds again. If there's a dry patch, try and run over it, just there's no dry pockets left, so you get an even extraction. And that cup of foam is a bit of an insulator. It's going to keep the coffee nice and hot as it brews. But when we really mix it up, that's going to be the main driver of pushing extraction up. You can, if you don't have scales and you're using scoops for the beans or the grounds and just using volumetrics, you can be somewhat accurate, but I would really encourage using some scales to brew coffee so you can be repeatable. If you figure a way to brew that you really enjoy, you can do that again every time and not be so hit and miss with brewing your coffee. I hope I've got enough in here. Let's see. It's going to be touch and go. Perfect. Have a little cup to hand as well so that we can rinse our spoons between breaking the bowls and when we skim. Just going to top up here. Doesn't really matter that this is cold water. Okay. We've got a couple of minutes before we actually need to go in and break the bowls, stir them up, agitate them, push that extraction up. So right now, for me, this is when I get a lot more information about the coffee's aromatic profile. So let's stick our noses in and really have a test of the coffees. Yeah, immediately from it being milk chocolate and roasted nuts, there's much more raisiny, plummy aroma coming out of Emilio Gomez. Just turned up some of the fruitier notes. It's dried fruit notes. It's not particularly like a fresh fruit. It's dried fruits I'm getting in this more than anything else. And chocolate biscuits, that kind of thing. And yeah, Miranda, that sort of tropical edge to the fruit. It's not a wild, natural processed coffee with lots of like pineapple and passion fruit kind of aromas to it. I've put mangosteens on the bag. It's like a cleaner tropical fruit to me. But there is some of that, yeah, very ripe tropical fruit to it, while still being very, very clean. And a little bit herbal as well, sort of positive herbal notes. Blind with other things on the table, part of me would maybe think this was Ethiopian coffee because of just how floral the coffee from Emilio Grande is. And once the water is in and you're smelling the wets, the florals are really amplified again. Somewhat hard to pinpoint exactly what floral I'm getting. Like a citrus blossom, maybe lime blossom or orange blossom or something like that. And a very, very full aroma in the Kaigori. Again, like cooking berries, like that really warm berry aroma to it. Very fun coffee. The Serenia decaf filter now smells to me like unrefined sugars, like panela or muscovado or something like that. Like a richer sugar, something if you're using in baking, like dark brown sugars. And we're coming up to 4 minutes, so process now is just rinse your spoon out. 3 nice mixes in the cups. And then we can clean off the foam on the top. Shaking. Some coffees put a lot of stock in the break as a really crucial part in determining the coffee's flavor profile, but for me I get more just smelling the crust before I break it. Whether that's a sort of roast or freshness thing, I'm not too sure, but this is just the same as the wets for me. You'll notice if you do a cupping with very darkly roasted coffee, you get a very, very fat cap of foam on the top. The coffee might not be quite so dense after it's roasted to a darker degree. A little fast. So it sort of all floats on the top a little bit more readily, and if the coffee's very fresh, it will fill more of the cup. Again, why it's important to use scales if you're doing cuppings with various changes in the roast date of the coffee or the roast degree. So some of you will have picked up spoons in this pack, some from the pack before. You can use soup spoons if you don't have these to hand, but these are perfectly designed for cupping coffee. Oh, nice. Cool. You don't have to skim as you go. You can break everything first, then clean it off if you're not so fast. I've done this a lot of times, so it's kind of second nature, but yeah, feel free to go at your own pace. All right. I have a spit cup to hand because I don't want to drink all this coffee, having already had a couple of cups of coffee today. And also, if you swallow the sample, you're going to have a longer retronasal experience of the coffee, a longer aftertaste that can maybe interfere with your assessment of the next coffee. It's very important to assess that because it's part of the coffee's characteristics. And if it's really positive, it would be a shame not to notice that and praise it in a coffee. So drinking it occasionally is a good idea, but for the purposes of flitting between and highlighting unique characteristics in each cup, I'm going to slurp, have a taste, think about the flavors, and then spit it out to not carry over too much. There'll be an element of it clinging to your tongue because there are sort of oils in coffee that won't just wash away, even if you're having water. One of the best things I've found to actually drink during cupping is just water that's not too cold. Some people say warm water, some people say like a chilled oolong tea or something. Some people say Diet Coke. I've heard all sorts of things. Sparkling water. It's the worst one for me because the abrasiveness on the tongue and the acidity perceived in there is slightly strange. Just water, plain, ideally a little bit warm, not super cold from a cold tap or from the fridge. It's perfect. I'm gonna have a little bit of that now. So we're at 7 minutes on the clock. You might think, if you're not used to brewing this kind of way, these cups are going to over-extract because the coffee and the water is still together. It's not been filtered out. And time is one of the ways we can increase extraction when we're brewing coffee. We always talk about the 3 T's, time, temperature, and turbulence. Temperature is pretty high, boiling water. Turbulence is pretty high because we give it a real good churn. But time's not really an issue here because if you look at your cups, if you're using glass, you can see this, like we're here. The grounds are settling. They're at the bottom, they're not really interfering with the brew liquor, they're not giving out any more of their solubles. We're pretty much as extracted as these cups are going to be. All that's going to happen now is that the actual brew liquor is going to clarify as the really tiny, fine, silty bits drop down to the bottom. And this is how I like to make a French press coffee, is do this process and then just wait and wait and wait as long as I'm willing to before decanting it out into another jug or into cups to avoid it being too silty. It's not going to over-extract, you don't need to worry about that, you just need to give it time to clarify naturally and form a little bed at the bottom. When we last did this tasting, I'm going to try and recall what coffees we had on the table. We had Yolanda Cabrera, which was another Peruvian coffee from the same group through which we've sourced Miranda. We had another Ecuador coffee, I believe it was Felipe Abad's coffee, which is from the south of Ecuador, unlike Familiar's, and a different variety. We had Mahembe, a washed Rwandan coffee. Here, the African coffee is Kaigori AA. It's not from Rwanda, but another African coffee. And the other one, I'll have to just check my notes because I have forgotten, which is terrible. We had Yuli Rosabel Parades, which was a washed Colombian coffee. So today we've got a Nicaraguan coffee instead of Colombian, but then we also have a Colombian here in the decaf. The reason that they are ordered in the way they are primarily is to do with lowest to highest perceived acidity with the decaf tacked on at the end, as it's a little bit of an ad hoc addition to the tasting pack. And that doesn't necessarily mean worst to best. some people in the coffee community, and myself included in the early days especially, was that they're acid junkies. You really like high acid coffees, and anything without that is kind of boring or flat or not interesting. But there are times when you want to have something with a lower, more integrated, riper acidity that's not super pronounced. If you're having a large mug of coffee in the morning and you're bleary-eyed still, something very sharp might be a little, a little too much. Or especially if you're having milk with your coffee, something a little more round and caramelly and chocolatey might be better for you. So anything past here, I wouldn't really be wanting to put milk in. Personally, I would never brew these coffees with milk in anyway, but it's definitely pleasant if you do that. You just might cover some of the characteristics of the coffee. So yeah, we're going from a Nicaraguan coffee from Emilio Gomez, single farm, single farmer. Same in Miranda, Huaman, Gregoria from Peru. Same with Familia Granda. It's a family effort from a farm in Ecuador. And then Kaigori is a little bit different. It's named after the washing station or the factory that they call it in Kenya, but produced by about 520 smallholders. And then Serenia Decaf filter. La Serenia is the mark given to a brand of coffees that Caravella source from the Pitalito region, and it's 38 families producing this coffee here. So sort of a blend if you're really being particular about it, but it's from one region, one quality tier, one region, one part of Colombia. So all single farms, cooperative coffee, and again, a community coffee here. As well as the increase in acidity, there might also be an increase in sort of the presence or the amount of flavor going on in the coffee. And actually, when I brew Emilio Gomez, especially as a morning coffee, I tend to up dose a little bit just to give it a bit more richness. It's a relatively simple coffee, so I think adding a little bit to your dose can really help bring it out. And actually with the Kaigori, I like to drop my dose because I find if I'm brewing 60 grams a litre, it can be quite overwhelming, quite intense. Part of that is due to the solubility of the coffee. I always find that Kenyan coffees are very easy to extract. You can grind them a little bit coarser than you normally would or drop your temperature and they'll still kick out a really nice extraction. So I can find 55 grams a litre a bit more appropriate with something like Kaigori. So here, all on an even keel to really hone in on the unique differences, but actually if I was brewing, I might tweak my recipe a little bit. 11 minutes, I don't want to taste yet. Some of you might be itching to dive in, and feel free, take a spoonful, have a taste if you like your coffee very, very hot. But actually I find for the purpose of tasting and really analysing the flavours in the cup, that's not very conducive. You don't do as well tasting things that are very far away from the temperature of your mouth. If you have something very, very hot or something very, very cold, the flavours are muted, especially sweetness. So things are sweetest when they're close to body temperature. That's why a lot of specialty coffee shops will serve you very lukewarm cappuccinos, because they know it's sweeter, they know it tastes better, and they want you to drink it in 2 sips. And you might want to have a hotter drink to nurse for longer, but for flavour, balance and sort of intensity of sweetness, it is better to serve them a little bit cooler. Not body temperature, that'd be kind of insane. But yeah, if you go hotter with milk drinks especially, it can mute that sweetness. That might be why you've experienced a not so hot flat white or cappuccino. So I like to leave these, in this setup, I like to wait about 15 minutes before really diving in. But then we will continue to taste as the coffees cool down, because things change. You might notice that sweetness becomes more prominent. You might notice that acidity opens up a little bit more. You might notice certain flavors drop in or come out. And as when they're really, really cool, if they're still tasting good, that's the testament of a really nicely produced coffee, but also really nicely roasted coffee, if it can carry through and be really good all the way down to room temperature. The other thing that's nice then is as well, you might be able to say, oh, I think I'd like this one as an iced coffee, if it's tasting really, really good at those cooler temperatures. And I think Kaigori is probably the one I go for, or Familia, for iced coffee, because the fruity and the floral notes really, really pop when they're served over ice. We have some techniques on how to make ice filter that you can watch on YouTube as well. A couple of minutes. I kind of don't want to dive too much into the details of each until we've tasted, and then we can sort of explain why a coffee might taste a certain way because of the variety and the process and everything. So I kind of want to leave that for just a quick second. All of these samples as well, in terms of our roasting style, you might be interested to know, we don't have a set colour that we try and aim for. We kind of let the coffee dictate what it wants to become and roast to highlight everything that it has to offer without pushing too much into a more developed roast and covering that with roasty notes, but also not roasting them so light that there are still green notes present in the coffee. It's a fine balance. There is seemingly a trend of people playing what we internally called roaster shove halfpenny, where you were trying to push a roast and there was like the cliff of roasty death, where you never wanted your coffee to tip over into that and have any presence of roasting notes whatsoever. As long as you were this side, it was okay, even if they were tasting green. And I really think that's fizzled out a bit lately. People are much more open to creating a more balanced, workable roast profile on the coffee. We obviously don't want them to just taste ashy or roasty or anything like that, but a little extra development can really help, especially with certain profiles. So we do use a color analyzer to see where everything is at, and whilst it's probably the least roasty tasting, the Kaigori is actually the darkest coffee on the table, objectively speaking. It's very, very sugary. We roast it to a very light temperature, but it accrues a lot of color during that roast cycle. And Emilio Gomez, I believe, is middling in the color, but we actually take it to a slightly higher end temperature to create that more comforting, chocolatey roast flavor profile. I think we can get away with starting to taste now. We're at 14.5 minutes. If you are cupping with someone else, new industry protocol now is to use a secondary cup to not taint the bowls with your cupping spoon. So some people do it with 2 spoons, which I find far too precarious and dribbly. So I just use another cup, take a sample, dose it out for just me. This would be for my lips, and this would be for the bowls, so that you can sort of safeguard. It's a precaution because of COVID, and we practice it in the roastery here when we're cupping, but as it's just me today, I'm not going to do this secondary cup protocol. I'm just going to cup normally. So if you're cupping by yourself, feel free to do as I do. Little rinse, and let's taste the coffees. I think I mentioned in the last video as well, the slurp is optional but advised. You want to spray as much of your mouth as possible, aerate the coffee. It does help to cool it at these hotter stages as well. You will get more from it the more you slurp. If you just drink it in, it will be delicious, I hope, but you'll taste more. It's like slurping wine, slurping tea, anything you're tasting. If you draw air into your mouth and move it around, you're going to experience more on your tongue and retronasally. So much of the work being done here is olfactory. It's from your nose, it's from the aromas in the cup whilst it's in your mouth, and then afterwards as well. Taste is just sweet, salt, bitter, sour, umami, and modulations of those interacting with each other. And then we have mouthfeel as well, which we can discuss. How does it feel on your tongue? Is it rough? Is it silky? And how's it leaving it? Does it feel dry, or does it feel like you've had something refreshing in your mouth? And for me, Emilio Gomez, the texture is very silky. It's very delicate, slim. We have a note on there of tea, and it's a sort of brisk tea-like quality to it, partly because it's a relatively slim mouthful, but it also has a slight bite to it in the way that tea can, that slight tannic edge. But primarily, I'm getting like a hazelnut and chocolate flavor to it. Some fruits, but they're relatively low in the mix. If you really search for them, I think you can find them. Kind of a glacé cherry thing. I really like how Emilio's coffee is very transparent, by which I mean you taste it clearly. It's very, very clear and crystalline, and it's not got like any real heft behind it, whilst being a classic coffee profile. You've not had to create that through heavy roasting or it being, you know, a very chunky coffee innately. It just has like a very comforting character whilst being very clean and slim and clear. So that's the flavors I'm getting on the first pass of Emilio, Miranda. It almost takes a couple of seconds when you've got the coffee in your mouth and you start to get this orange rind and this mangosteen thing. Green gage is the other fruit we have on there, and it's that sort of soft, fleshy fruit without being too sour or piercing and without being too funky tropical like a really ripe papaya or anything. But it's got this really lovely fruity quality to it. Again, very clean and clear. Great balance to it as well. And actually, I'm very impressed with this coffee in particular of the coffees we've sourced from Valle Inca Group for its longevity, because this, along with another coffee on the table, are getting to a year old off the tree, which a few years back we wouldn't have really entertained as possible as roaster touting freshly harvested coffee. But it's about how the coffee tastes as much as how old it is objectively. How the coffee's been produced and dried will have a massive impact on the shelf life. And if we're not happy with a coffee, we won't be roasting and selling it. I'm so happy with how Miranda is holding up. It's a testament to great practices, thanks to the work Valle Inca are doing, supporting their producers. We'll go into more detail on it, but I just wanted to say that whilst it is an older crop coffee, in essence, the beginning harvest of this year, it tastes fresh as a daisy. Familia Granda. Immediately now, I think you step up and you start to get to that real mouth-watering acidity. It's a bit limey, very fresh, and it's got this great, elegant balance with these like top notes of florals popping off whilst being sort of citric and clean and layered. And I think this coffee evolves very nicely on cooling as well. We'll see as we come back to it, it starts to open up and become a little broader. It's still quite tight and pinpointed right now. And wonderfully sweet, again, for a coffee which is a little older on the table. And then Kaigori AA. Yeah, this gets people excited about really good coffee. Always happens once during a cupping, sorry. Wrong way. So full of red fruits, all the red fruits you can imagine in abundance, very, very tart acidity, yet in balance. Acidity is not the only thing you can praise about Kenyan coffees. They have a great body to them too. And I find this one tastes a lot syrupier than the others. Almost like we brewed it with more coffee, which is why I like to brew it when I make a cup with less coffee, because it seems to give a little more, get more bang for your buck. So whilst it's more expensive to buy a bag, actually it will go a little further if you adopt a lower brew ratio with it. This might be a little hard tasting Colombian coffee after Kenyan, but I think it's still a good idea. If you say you're someone that doesn't like decaf, I think if we didn't write decaf on the bag, people wouldn't necessarily think it was, because I don't get any fingerprint or trace of a decaffeinated process flavor, which you do get with some methods like a Swiss water or CO2 method. Here, I find this incredibly sweet. It's kind of honeycomb-like. It's very, very caramelly. Really, really lovely. Yeah, this unrefined sugar thing to it, like panela, I think is really present and super nice. Slim body again, but yeah, just loads and loads of sweetness carrying through. And we have a little bit of this to roast for espresso as well. We tend to buy different lots for filter and espresso, but sometimes they marry up. And La Serenia is a coffee we've worked with for a few years. We know how it roasts, we know how to work with it quite well. And I love it. I think it's really great. And I've actually dabbled a little bit with blending this with another coffee if it's the afternoon. I want to just have a little bit of caffeine, but not a whole cup's worth. So you can do that if you've got your sample packs. If you want to try half and half, I think with Miranda would be a nice mix. So that's our first pass. We're going to come back and taste them again as they cool down. They're still on the warm side, so I still think we've not accessed everything they have to offer. But I want to tell you a little bit about the farms themselves or the factories to explain why we think these are great coffees and maybe why the flavors are there in the cup. So let's start with Emilio Gomez at the front. We didn't used to buy Nicaraguan coffee. It had a bit of a bad reputation as having a very short shelf life. Relatively hot and dry country without too much in the way of high altitude coffees. And I think a lot of the reason that we'd experienced issues with coffees going woody quite quickly was that the drying was done pretty rapidly, and everything kind of happened very quick. You know, the fruit matured relatively quick, the processing was quick, and the drying phase was quick. However, we tasted some coffees from Caravella, where they have their own infrastructures built to dry processed parchment coffee. So they will go and buy coffee that's already been picked, pulped, fermented, and washed. But then they take it wet to their facilities. In this case, it's in Ocotal. It's called Beneficio La Estrella. And there they have the most perfect drying conditions for coffee because they've built a tiered raised bed system with multiple degrees of shade netting. They have these specially designed rakes to comb through the coffee as it dries. They have hygrometers and temperature probes, really nicely trained team of staff. They pull samples all the time, they're cupping continually, and they're able to lock in the quality produced at the farm level. That's the way I want to think about it. They're not sort of adding the value. They are preserving that value. So I think it's a really valid service that they're doing there. So Emilio Gomez, his farm is called Finca San Antonio in El Naranjo in Dipilto region, which is in the north of Nicaragua, sort of near to Honduras. And it's about 1,500 meters, which is quite high altitude for a farm in Nicaragua. He has mostly Caturra and some Margohipe as well, but he keeps them separate during harvesting because Margohipe beans are very big. They warrant a slightly different approach because you need to recalibrate your depulping machine. If you try to put Caturra and Margohipe mixed through a depulper, you would have some Caturra that wasn't pulped at all or some smashed up Margohipe seeds. So he has them separate. And what was exciting was when we first cupped with Caravella in Ocotal in Nicaragua, one of the lots that really stood out was this lot from Finca San Antonio where they had been trialing longer fermentation periods. If you're not sure what that means, I'll try and explain. After you pick the coffee cherries, you need to somehow get to a point where it's a dried seed, and that involves removing the fruit layer. Whether that's done, you dry the coffee as a natural or dry process, and then you mill it all with the dried fruit off, or you depulp it and break off the mucilage layer somehow. You can dry it with the mucilage on in a honey process, or you can ferment it or break it down, or use mechanical depulpers to remove the mucilage. Mechanical demucilaginators, sorry, to remove the mucilage. In this case, he's depulping in a fairly rustic setup into a concrete tank, covering it with a corrugated iron lid. And the first lot we tried from him was 22 hours fermentation. That's very high for Nicaragua, for that region where it's more typically 8 to 10 hours, pretty modest, just until the beans are squeaky and you can wash them and get rid of that mucilage and get clean parchment. But they were trying to encourage farmers to prolong the fermentation period to introduce a bit more flavour dimensions to the coffee. You can push it too far and get wild fermented acetic tasting coffee. And we did try some 36 hours and even up to 60 hours where it just had gone completely rogue, vinegar bombs in every cup. Not our style. Some people love that, not for us. But 22 hours fermentation seemed to be a pretty sweet spot for Emilio Gomez. What's more interesting to me as well, the way he's actually working on the farm is really admirable. He's got a lot of shade trees, so it's typically going to be quite a dry environment there. So he's really trying to preserve as much moisture as possible. So he's got a lot of shade canopy, but also all the dry matter that comes down, he's not clearing. He's keeping that on soil to lock in that moisture, applying fertilizers throughout the year, but he also makes, from the processing water, he breaks it down in these barrels with particular strains of fungi and everything, so that he's creating these like broken down agrumiels to then spray on the trees to act as a homemade fungicide and a bit of extra nutrition. So he's got a lot of really sensitive way of working with the trees on his farm. His family all helps out. They have a few pickers hired during the harvest. But I think it's a really admirable approach to working with coffee that he's got. And I like that he's growing Caturra as well and wants to keep those sort of more traditional Nicaraguan varieties going rather than just jump into newer, more higher yielding or more resistant varieties that maybe won't taste quite so good. There are some fantastic ones and it's good to be diverse. But the Caturra from Emilio I think is really great. He's also got some other food crops like plantains, lots of different citrus fruits, so many different citrus fruits, and some cattle on the farm as well. And he's bought a new plot called Regado dos Rios nearby as well. So he's expanding and continuing to work in coffee, which is super fantastic. It's the second time we've roasted this coffee, and I hope not the last. We can't wait to go back and see him again because he was a very gracious host. And I want to pet Simba, his dog, again, who was really lovely when we visited. That's Emilio's Caturra. Miranda, one of the producers working with the Valle Inca group in Peru's Cusco region. And we got introduced to those from a group called Promoting Peru, who want to highlight Peru's specialty produce, including coffee, and took a trip with them to meet Jose Prudencio, who is the president of the association. A few years back in 2018, when we began working with their coffees, there was 100 members dotted around various very remote regions, particularly around Calca in Cusco. And now that's 261 producers because they're doing such a good job of providing access to market for the people's coffee, but also providing infrastructure and training and pre-financing. And they are very much wanting to support the farmers they're working with. So Miranda's farm, Mesa Pata, is at 2,000 meters. So we're jumping up quite a bit in altitude. And along with that, we're fermenting for a bit longer because it's a cooler climate. And we've got Bourbon coffee trees here. Not practicing much pruning with some of the value producers. They let them get quite tall and they're happy to bend them over to pick. But I think it's a really nice, sweet Bourbon. And the way they're fermenting is quite interesting. Some people are going to call it anaerobic, and that's fine if they want to call it that, but really what they're doing is using a manually cranked depulping machine, collecting the mucilage-covered parchment, sealing it into a Grain Pro bag within a barrel with a carboy system on the top to expel oxygen as the fermentation creates CO2, and it will ferment in that more controlled environment. And the more controlled environment is really the thing that interests me because they're armed with something which is repeatable. It's not as prone to the elements if you're doing it in a particular sealed environment. 39 hours in this case, which seems very, very long, but actually the coffee is squeaky clean, and we have tasted some longer ferments, which you do get some of that fermented fruit character creeping in, but here I think it's still very clean, very tropical, and yeah, the way they're drying in polytunnels, secadores, they have raised beds, well ventilated, so you get good airflow, but it's again sort of protected from the elements a little bit, turned over continually, and it's holding up beautifully. So I really like Miranda's coffee. We have had Yolanda's coffee before this, which was a slightly different approach to fermentation, a little bit more buxom in the fruit flavor. And we're about to start roasting an espresso from another producer there that we've worked with for 3 years called Agustin Casacoyo, which is also fantastic. Another Bourbon from slightly higher elevation. For me, this is awesome. And again, we haven't been working with Peru that long. About 2018 was when we started, pretty much exclusively with the Valle Inca group through Promoting Peru, but also Nordic Approach have begun some interesting projects in the north in Peru that we're quite excited by as well. Third on the table, Familia Granda. Quite interesting in the variety in this instance. Again, Caravella doing some really interesting stuff in Ecuador. They have a great pecker team on the ground with trained agronomists to dispense advice on everything from how to prune your trees, care for them, what to use for inputs, at what time during the year. They have a coffee compass calendar where you mark the initial flowering, and it tells you every stage throughout the year what to be doing to maximize yield and tree health which ultimately will result in better, sweeter coffee. So in this case, Familia Grande is named for the whole family. We were calling this coffee Ramiro Grande for the first couple of years we worked with it, but actually it's branched out and now his children are taking on a lot of the duties as well as his wife. And it just seems like a family endeavor, so we felt like it's more suitable to call it Familia Grande. Last year, it was a blend of Típico Mejorado and Típica. First year was just Típico Mejorado because the Típicas had been stumped back and weren't producing. And actually, I really like working with it as a single variety. Last year was tricky to roast, really tricky, because whilst they sound similar, Típico and Típico Mejorado, they're very distinct varieties. Típico is a very spindly tree, not high yielding, and will roast a particular way. Mejorado, they were calling because it seemed like an improved Típica, more vigorous, more high yielding, and fantastic cup quality. And actually, when World Coffee Research did some genetic testing on leaf cuttings, they realized it was actually a Bourbon Geisha cross. It had come from an experimental plot run by Nestle in Pichincha and kind of smuggled out by the workers to dispense to their friends and family who were growing coffee, and it's been planted, and I think it's delicious. And I think maybe because of the Geisha parentage, that's where some of the floral tendencies in the coffee are coming from. But it is very difficult to roast, I won't lie. I find coffees from the north of Ecuador, particularly this variety, have a real limit where they can just fall flat. And if you roast past that point, you lose a lot of what's special about them. So we take this fairly light, and I think the benefits are really nice perceived acidity, really floral, and a delicate coffee that's very layered and very sweet. An interesting one. Not a huge fermentation time, 18 hours, pretty long, but I think maybe that slightly more modest time is why the coffee has held up so well. This is actually our third Ecuador of the season. We roasted Jorge Tapia's coffee first, and then Felipe's, and then this. And the reason for that was that when we first were tasting this and cupping it throughout the year, it still tasted closed. It wasn't yet expressing, so it's got a really long arc to drink, to roast and drink, which again is great for us as roasters to be able to be flexible. It's more likely we're going to be able to work with someone if we don't have to shoehorn roasting their coffee into a couple of months window when it's good, if it's good for a longer time. So a lot to praise about Familia Grande. Again, growing a lot of other crops. Miranda has some rocoto peppers and some pacay shade trees, but he's got avocados, he's got citrus fruits again. I believe he has an irrigation system as well, because not too much rain or too much water there, but it's a case of, well, what do I choose to benefit, my avocado crops or my coffee crops? Where am I going to get more money? Which market's up? Which is high yielding this year? So it's a business for him. He has to maximize his profits. I'm really glad he's still working in coffee because there's a lot of pressure to move away from coffee. Kaigori, very different to the rest in flavor and in how it's produced. The Muteca Farmers Cooperative Society are the group that own the Kaigori washing station and operate it, along with 7 in total, I believe it is, in Nyeri, Kihuyo, Mutuaini, Chorongi, Kigwandi, and some others. They've been operating it since 2004. Before that, it was the Tetu Coffee Growers Association that established the coffee washing station in 1969. The actual coffee is grown in 4 different locales around the station, which is Gondo, Gura, Gitaka, and Kaigori itself. And those smallholders are working at about 1,700 to 1,800 meters with really like rich red volcanic soils. And so that starting block is going to allow any crop to grow really nicely, including coffee. And it's a mixture of varieties in this case, SL28 and SL34, which you've probably seen on every Kenyan coffee bag you've ever bought. And then some newer varieties, Ruriru 11 and Batian. The SL28 and 34 were developed in the 1930s by Scott Labs. They were breeding between, I believe it was sort of Bourbons, Kents and French Mission varieties. And they introduced some parentage from a Tanganyikan drought-resistant variety from Tanzania. The idea being to create a drought-resistant variety that had some of the benefits of Bourbons and good cup quality. And it does, it absolutely does. SL28 and SL34 have wonderful cup quality and have been taken to Central America and popularized there as well. But they're primarily sort of Kenyan varieties. But then to battle coffee berry disease and leaf rust, Ruriru 11 was developed in the 80s. I think there is some Tahimo hybrid parentage in there, mixed with SL28 and Sudan Rumey. And then more recently, Batian in 2010 was introduced. I'm not entirely sure of the parentage. I would have to look it up. I can't remember it right now. But the idea being to be a slightly higher cup quality than the Ruriru 11. It's very hard to say. I've only ever tasted them blended. The only times I've tasted Batian separately was at an experimental plot in El Salvador. So totally different soils and processing techniques to Kenya. But you can imagine the washing station has adapted over the years because of these new varieties being brought in and other things in the area having a competition for where the producers are going to sell their coffee cherries. So Kaigori, under the Mutheka Cooperative Society, have a motto of Urumwe Uteri na Utonga, which means transparency, wealth, and unity. Maybe not in that order. Can't remember the order. But basically, they really want to empower their coffee producers and keep them working with coffee. So they pay premium payments for high quality coffee coming in to around the 520 or so that grow coffee near to Kaigori. But they're also holding seminars on agricultural techniques, providing ease of access to inputs that they might need to make sure their trees are in good health and everything. So they're supporting them in a sort of social and agronomical sense rather than just financially. The actual process at the washing station is to first hand sort the collections that are brought in before depulping on a large 3-disc pulper, and they ferment overnight in a large tank, wash it with clean water from the Gura River, and then it is held in soak pits, held in soak tanks to clean it up a little bit further before going onto raised beds for about 15 days or so. So actually I think everything here is raised bed dried, which is kind of cool, apart from the Serenia. Anything that is muddied during the processing, the water that is loaded up with enzymes and particulates will be treated in soak pits before going back to the water table. So it's a lot of water usage, but they do responsibly treat it before it goes back into the local water table. And you know that the varieties, the soil, and the processing techniques just give you such a classic Nyeri Kenyan profile with all of that fruity, berry, tart flavour. I think it's fantastic. And AA just refers to the size of the beans. They grade by size, typically in Kenya, and the 3 specialty tiers that are exported to specialty roasters like us is AA, AB, which is slightly smaller, and PB, which is a pea berry when you just have a single round, dense seed within a coffee cherry that are siphoned off and kept separate. And they can be fun to roast as well. For us, it's not necessarily about AA being better than AB or AB being better than PB, but it's just what cups the best for us, and we're going to take that coffee. I think it's the second time we've bought from the Mutheka Farmers Cooperative Society, but first time with Kaigori. So third year with the group, but first time with Miranda, third year with Familia, and second time with Mutheka, first time with Kaigori. And then third time working with La Serenia Decaf from Caravella again, one of their marks. And this is, like I said before, 38 families within Pitelito, tending to kind of the classic mix of the 3 Cs of Colombian coffee varieties, Variedad Colombia, Caturra, and Castillo. It's hard to pinpoint exactly how the coffee is being processed because there'll be slight differences depending on the particular climate at each person's farm, but it's a fermentation period of so many hours before being fully washed and dried in a mixture of patios, or what's called casa elbas, where you have a rooftop drying patio where you can slide a roof over the top to protect it overnight. So it's maybe a slightly more rustic processing approach without the beds and not having so much clarity in the information. But the way that the lots like this are built is to ensure individual lots reach a certain quality tier before they're collated together and blended to keep a sort of character of that region intact and it not be just all over the place. So it's fully homogenized before being bagged up and sent to us to be roasted. That's a little detail, maybe a lot if you're not too au fait with how coffee production works. But for me, I think what's nice is that these are mostly coffees we've worked with before or intend to again and again, a spread of different varieties and origins. At one time in the year, that's kind of hard to do and ensure everything is going to taste fresh and vibrant and lively, but that's due to, we plan ahead almost a whole year when we're buying and trying to create diversity and deliciousness and something for everyone. If you want just coffee, you've got something this end of the spectrum. If you want something really interesting and unusual, you've got these kind of coffees. I want to have one more taste to see if anything's changed, and then we're going to look at the Q&A, if that's working. I've got a few in there that I'll come to. One more taste, throw in any flavors you get. If you have a favorite, if you have something you don't like, feel free to voice that as well, and we'll see. I'll check in later on what everyone's favorite was. You could almost tell me there was a drop of cream put in here if I was cupping it blind, because it's now become a little bit creamier. Maybe that's the sort of the nuttiness here. Nuttiness is a very divisive word to use when you're cupping and marketing your coffee, because it can suggest like less ripe or less developed roast. But for me, it's like a creamy hazelnut or cashew kind of nuttiness to it, roasted nuts even. So it's a little richer. It's a little more developed than just a raw nut or peanutty flavour, which is not a good thing to get in coffee. And maybe some of that plummy cherry flavour is coming out as well on cooling. Still quite a low acidity coffee, but what acidity it does have is very integrated and it gels very well with the other characteristics in the coffee. So I find it very, very pleasant. And like I say, this is my morning coffee. I would drink this every morning and be super happy. Miranda, how have you cooled? it's a little more fun. It has a bit more of that fruitiness going on. I'm now getting a bit of cacao nib, which I've not really had in here before. That's a new one on me. And it's hinting at some florals as well. I have honeysuckle written on the bag because it's a slightly less delicate, fleeting floral than you might get in the Familia. It's a bit sort of sweeter. Hugely sweet though, I think, and yeah, a bit more intense on the palate than Emilio. I really love this coffee, and Ecuador is a little bit of a tricky place to be working because the coffees can be quite expensive. The costs of production are very, very high in Ecuador, and it's a little hard to justify something that might be on an even keel with another country in terms of cup score alone. But I find this, you can't find this kind of flavor profile in many places. This mixture of like a classic South American sweet, robust flavor profile with florals and acidity like an Ethiopian. It's very unusual to find that anywhere else, so I really love it. And then Kaiguri. Very rhubarby now. I love it. It's the first Kenyan of the year for us. We have another one lined up from Muchagara, which is an AB lot. And when we bought the two this year, we wanted to have two quite distinct profiles, so it wasn't just two of the same Kenyas coming out. This one is more on the sort of hibiscus, rosehip, red currant, tart end of the spectrum. Muchagara has more of that blackberry and that richness of cocoa and ice cream. So hopefully they'll be quite distinct. I don't believe we'll offer them at the same time because Muchagara is still tasting a little greenish to me. But when we do start roasting it, you might remember how this was and then taste Muchagara and realize like they are quite distinct profiles. And then Serenia Decaf filter. Some nuttiness coming in, kind of like a walnutty thing. Cocoa again, carob, that kind of chocolate substitute that's a little bit like chocolate but not quite. And yeah, all the types of brown sugar for me, it's really unusual. But and I can explain a bit about the decaf process if anyone is interested in that. What time are we on? Okay, it's been the best part of an hour. I don't want to take up too much of your Saturday, so I'm going to look and see what questions we have coming in. I really hope you like the tasting. Let's look at some of those and see what we can say. Could you talk about where the coffee flavor starts and the roasting makes a difference? Yes. The philosophy which I abide to is that in the green coffee, it's just flavor precursors. You try and brew a cup of green coffee, it's not a coffee flavor. What you have are certain acids and certain sort of sugars and amino acids and proteins and fats, and it's a very hard, waxy, dense substance. But where it's grown is going to completely dictate what it will become when you roast it. So you can't just buy any old green coffee and roast it a certain way to make it taste of cherry or chocolate. It has to have those precursors or that potential that you untap in the roasting process. For us, we don't want to create a certain flavor profile by blending either, really. We want to have the coffee speak for itself. So what we're doing is the idea of this untapping or realizing the potential. I don't want to feel too Aristotelian today, but basically that's the way I feel about it, is there's potential quality in here, which we unlock with a careful, considered roast approach. We will initially sort of test roast and sample roast the coffee when it's arrived in the country using a small electric sample roaster called an Ikawa. 50 grams of coffee, 50 grams of coffee. And that will give us a sort of starting block of like, well, what's the style? What's the body like? What's the sweetness like? Do we need to push the development hard? Is it very dense? Does it need heat applied gently? What sort of end temperature are we going to aim for? We'll put a real detailed plan together to turn an initial batch on full scale on our P25 ProBat roaster. And then we will refine that as we go, and every week we will taste every batch we do to just tweak and refine and trial new plans and just get the coffee into as sweet a spot as possible. So initially it's like getting onto the road, and then as we go it's just, motorway driving, just changing lanes, making sure we're as accurate as bringing out all of the potential in the coffee as possible. So I think that covers it. Where does coffee flavor start and has roasting made a difference? You can totally annihilate a coffee's potential with a bad roast. I don't think just buying good coffee is enough. It's not easy to buy good coffee, but it's a lot easier because there are so many more people selling good coffee. You have to pay for it, of course, and pay a good price. But actually roasting is quite difficult, I believe. It takes a lot of work and it takes a lot of honesty. It's very easy to just pat yourself on the back if you like something, but we try and really brutally assess our coffees each week, and people can be left in a bit of a downer because we can be really hard. Here I'm trying to sing the praises, but if I was looking at it with my jeweler's loop and really looking for problems to fix, I may not be so kind. I might say, actually, I would tweak this end temperature, or I would stretch this drying phase or something like that. But I actually am very happy with how they're tasting at the moment. But maybe I would reveal some of the problems as well. Mike, typically, how long is it from picking a bean to roasting in the UK? Yeah, great question. So picking a bean, I will just try and clarify a little more, because obviously it's picking a fruit, it's picking the cherries, which from picking that to it being dried coffee is a period in itself. So we might put a month or a couple of months that can take if multiple lots from a farm have been put together. So let's say, for example, Emilio. Sort of November into December will be when the coffees are mature and they will begin picking, and the cosecha, the harvest, will take place over the next few months. And during the sort of real prime fillet section of the harvest is when there's most of the mature fruit available, is when we'll be buying the lots from. So the early pickings might not be quite so mature and interesting, and they will be a high commodity grade, or have some benefits to get a premium payment for, but maybe not specialty grade in the cup. So let's say this was picked January to February kind of time. It's got to then obviously be depulped and fermented. It's a day or two to do so, maybe 10 to 20 days or so to dry. But actually his will be transported to the Octal facility to dry down. After that point, it will be quality graded by Caravella, and they will send us samples. And once we approve a pre-shipment sample or a pre-milling sample, actually to be more specific, we would have to go ahead to mill the coffee, which is put it through the dry mill, remove the parchment layer, density grade it, size grade it, color sort it, and then it will go into grain pro liners in Hessian sacks and put onto a container in the next month or two. Well, ideally in the next week or so once it's been milled, but it'll get onto a container and actually leave the country soon after that. And then it can be it's very difficult to say now because of fallout from the Ever Given. There's still a whole issue with containers around the world, and shipping times are flipped on their head. But it'll be a few months before it arrives to us, maybe anything between, let's say, 2 and 4 months before we can start to roast it. But quite a lot of the time, the moment a coffee arrives isn't the best time to be roasting it. If it's a high moisture coffee, or has high water activity, or it's got a lot of fermentation flavors to it, you probably want to start roasting it very, very soon. But we're trying to find coffees with a bit more longevity to them and actually get them into the country when they're still on the up, when they're still opening up and increasing in their complexity and developing. So a little resting period can actually be very beneficial for us. Obviously, it's a shame because sometimes coffees do land and they've degraded, and then it's a case of trying to get them out very fast or finding another outlet for them. But primarily, we'd be working with a coffee off harvest from anything from, let's say, 4 to 6 to 8 months. And sometimes, like we have today, coffee might run for a year plus, if they're very, very nicely processed and dried. And that's relatively new. It's only for the last couple of years we've been able to do that because of a harsher vetting process in the sample stages. We have a lot more tools at our disposal to do so, including water activity measurement, UV screening, and moisture, as well as a lot of rigorous cupping, and knowledge about how it's been produced. So it's a many answers really. For us, it can be anything from, let's say, picking 4-5 months or so from picking we would start roasting to a year, 13 months, 14 months maximum, I would imagine. So it can spread. It can really spread. I hope that answers the question. Is the decaf naturally processed? Yes. It's one of the processes that can be marketed as natural. Swiss water can be marketed as natural, as can CO2. Methylene chloride cannot, but ethyl acetate processing can, because it's derived from sugarcane. It might sound like I'm trying to make excuses for it, but that sounds like a scary chemical compound. But basically, you take sugarcane, you ferment it down, you make molasses, you ferment it, you make ethyl acetate, which is like a simple vinegary alcohol, and you mix it with water, and you steam the green coffee, and you bathe it in that to target the caffeine and get that out until there's 0.1 or less caffeine in the green beans. So it's one of them that can be marketed as natural. I hope that answers the question. We have a video on our decaffeination process which goes into a lot more detail if you want to check that out. We'll put it in the description below maybe, because that explains it better than I can remember off the top of my head now, and also it takes a little bit of time. But yes, I believe it is one of the natural processes you can have. Once cupped and you have an idea of flavour and texture, does that affect which brew method you choose for it? V60, Kalita, Airpress, Clever, etc. And if so, how do you get to that decision? Somewhat. So here, obviously, there's no filtration happening besides the clarifying. You know, it's like racking off a wine. You can still have a pretty clear-looking wine even if you've not filtered it, if you do good racking and things. Here, it's not being filtered though, so we're getting all the oils and things. I quite like the idea that if you cup of coffee and the thing that you fall in love with is its body, if it's like really creamy or syrupy, it's a shame to then put that through a Chemex, for example, with a really thick bonded paper that will strip out a lot of body, leave you a lot of clarity, but you will lose the thing that you liked about the coffee. Whereas if something's very delicate and sort of fleeting and ethereal, it might not be the thing you want to put in a French press because the clarity and the poise might be what you like. So a paper filtration like a drip filter like a V60 or something would help. But actually I'm not too heavily in the camp of these kind of coffees need to be brewed like this, these kind of coffees need to be brewed like this. I think if it's a nice coffee that's been roasted well and is robust enough to perform well across a range of brew methods, I would probably say any filter method is appropriate. And that's our philosophy with our filter roast at least. With our espresso roasted coffees, they suit espresso brewing better for my preferences, but I know a lot of people brew our filter roasts as espresso and really enjoy them because they're very fruit forward and very brisk. And I know that some people prefer to brew our espresso roasts in filter methods because they like a bit more weight to the coffee, which we get through the extra development, and if they're having milk especially. So I think the roast style, more than the coffee characteristics, would determine how to brew, but all of our filters, as we discussed, are relatively lightly developed, light to medium kind of roast style. So any filter method will be nice. But yeah, the more you clarify, the thicker the paper, for example, or the less pressure going through, the slimmer the body will be. But you know, flavor clarity is really nice. So these do taste different when you brew them. But sometimes you highlight, sometimes you hide. It's a payoff. But this is a really great way to taste and drink coffee. If you pour this across into a mug, it's delicious. Thank you, Nathan. Do you know what coffee you will have as an espresso as opposed to a filter? What do you think about when deciding? Again, somewhat. That's more driven by volume availability than and somewhat price. Because the espresso coffees we sell, especially to wholesale clients, are bought in much larger volumes, and people are very price sensitive. We do have to. It would be tricky to, for example, roast Kaigori as espresso and have it sell before. If we bought enough to register for espresso, I don't believe we would be making so many sales of it in wholesale. Retail is a different matter because people are very happy to spend a lot on fantastic coffee and get a lot of enjoyment from it. So primarily it would be a case of, is there enough coffee? There isn't enough of a lot of these coffees to have bought for espresso, otherwise we'd be roasting them and threw them in a matter of weeks, 3 weeks maybe, which you can do, but all of the admin of like getting the release ready and all the test roasting, everything, we'd be churning through it so much. I worry that we wouldn't be on point with all the roasting if we changed our espressos every 2-3 weeks. So they tend to run for a bit longer. So it's not really about quality. It's more volume availability, which is tied to quality, volume availability, somewhat price. And every now and then I do, when I'm cupping, write down espresso potential. If the flavors are not too amplified, I find a very, very intense tasting coffee in espresso can be, one, overwhelming, but also you lose the complexity in a way, when everything is so bunched together in such a concentrated brew style. So something that's a little more balanced and easygoing, once it's then truncated and pushed together in an espresso, that's when you get really nice, intense, balanced espresso. But kind of like the green coffee philosophy thing we talked about before, if it's good coffee, it will make for great filter and great espresso, if it's roasted properly and brewed properly. So as a business, we have one answer, but philosophically speaking, good coffee can be good however you want to brew it, if it's roasted well and brewed well. I hope that answers that as well. How would the decaffeinated filter work as an espresso? Okay, it would be quite slim, maybe a little sour, but we have the espresso roast decaf as well. If you have an espresso machine at home and you just have this to dial in, it's not much coffee to dial in anyway, so you might struggle. Have a go with it, of course, probably not in a milk drink, but yeah, we have decaf espresso roasts as well. We used to just offer decaf espresso roasts and say how to brew that as filter coffee, but over the years we've realized that a lot of people want to brew decaf filter, so we now have dedicated roast profiles for each, who are not omni roasters, never have been, but I think yeah, with decaf now we split it out into the two camps. So you could have a go, but it might be, yeah, a bit on the sour side, I would imagine. With global warming, do you think you will see coffee from new regions? Are there any new coffee growing regions recently? Oh, yeah, it's relatively depressing looking at the future of coffee in light of global warming and climate change. But the beacon of light that we believe in is World Coffee Research, and they hold international multi-location variety trials, whereby they are putting their core collection of varieties from Kati in different plots that experience drought or frost or high temperatures, low temperatures, shade, not shade. And they're trying to see what's going to work in an ever-changing world and earmark not just what's going to yield good fruit and you know, produce coffee, but also produce really great specialty coffee. And actually we're getting a sample pack of their core collection to taste, and we'll be putting a little document together on a little video on that together so that you can hopefully learn a bit about that as well. New producing regions, of course. There's a little bit of some racing up in altitude, and other places that may not have been able to before are able to produce coffee. I don't feel like I can fully answer that today in a lot of detail, but yes, a lot of regions are experiencing massive problems, and the most recent example being a big frost that hit Brazil and severely impacted a lot of yields from this harvest, which then threw the C market, the global coffee commodity price market, into disarray, and we saw record peaks recently, which is somewhat fallen back in, but all sorts of issues to do with global warming, climate change, facing coffee producers especially, yeah. Do you allow people to come and visit the roastery? I'd love to see how you work. Yes. I'm going to say yes because we are on the cusp of properly opening to the public. We're beginning to build out a little shop window so you can come and buy a bag of beans, maybe buy a brewer, something like that. We've wanted to do it for a long time. We obviously weren't able to 2020 and recently because of COVID restrictions. But we have always had people come in if they're curious and pass by. If we have the time to welcome and show them around, we would do that. We have wholesale clients visit all the time. We have some people who have ordered online and want to pick up. But we're going to make that a bit more formal that they can come in. We probably won't be running a espresso bar or filter bar. If you're lucky and you come in at the right time, we might have something dialed in that you can taste. But absolutely, I would say probably not for a week or so, but we will do some announcements on Instagram and potentially on YouTube as well. But yeah, check out our social media to see when the doors are officially open and you can come in, meet the team, see the process, and buy a bag of beans and maybe have a brew with us if you come at a lucky time. So yes, hopefully, yes. So you can suspend the aging of a coffee when it comes into the UK. Some supermarkets do that with fruit, right? Okay. I believe maybe I was misunderstood with that. It's suspending the aging isn't exactly what I would say. Some roasters do that by actually freezing their green coffee consignments. There's a roastery in Canada called Phil and Sebastian that are not exactly pioneers of this, because I believe George Howell was doing it before, but they are a proponent of freezing green coffee and roasting from frozen to sort of halt the degradation. The coffee has a viable embryo in it. It's always going to be depleting and using up resources and degrading over time. The point I'm trying to make is that through smart purchasing, we're buying lots that innately, through proper storage, don't degrade at the rate that they might have done if they weren't produced so nicely. So it's not like we're pumping in strange gases on your unripe bananas or keeping apples in cold store or anything like that, or it's called clamping carrots, I believe, when you put them in the sand. It's nothing like that. It's more through intelligent purchasing. We're trying to buy lots that will innately hold up well. We're not doing anything artificial to them. What we do here is have a green acclimatization room, so that once we've got the coffees in from external warehouses that we use, we can sort of condition it to the right temperature and humidity level before we roast it. But that's more for roasting consistency than anything to do with the aging of the lots. But cold storage is typically better. You know, if we weren't happy with the warehouse, if we found that the lots were degrading too fast, we would look at something else. But they're typically like nice controlled humidity and temperature environments where the coffee is warehoused. I hope that makes more sense. I think that's it on the questions. I've not got any more on my sheet. Here we are. We've had a little taste. I'm definitely going to taste again, but I'm not going to have you watch me do that for a third time, because I'm sure you've heard enough slurping and are getting pretty sick of my voice. Hour and 10, you should go and have a lovely lunch now that you've had a little bit of caffeine, and maybe think about brewing one of these up in the afternoon to share with your friends and your family. I really hope you enjoy these coffees. They're obviously roasted on the 5th. They've still got a lot of life in them. You don't need to get through them in the next couple of days. They'll be really nice. Just seal the bags up, keep them in your cupboard nice and dry. And really, thank you so much for tuning in and for tasting with us. As I mentioned too, I think it was Aisha was asking about if we're open. No, who was asking? Gareth. Yeah, soon maybe we can do these kind of things in person and meet you all and say thank you in person for joining us. But I think that's it for today. I think we're going to wrap up. Unless there's anything else. We good? Great. Well, yeah, thank you again. Enjoy your coffees. Do be in touch. You can always email us as well on betterbrewing@workshopcoffee.com if you have any queries about our coffees or how to brew them, brewing advice, or if you want to go into more details on anything in particular. And I think I mentioned about as well about there's the decaf video you can watch. For all of these coffees, we have an in-focus video on our YouTube as well, where we try and go into a bit more detail, show some pictures from the farm and everything. I believe the Kaigori one will come out next week. We just filmed it this week. So you can learn a bit more about them there, as well as on our website. not going to try and do too much sales right now, but just to say, yeah, thank you very much. Hope you enjoyed your time, and we'll see you in a few months for another one. So yeah, take care. We'll see you soon.